next step on this project is these big muffler sections. As I touched on in the previous video, there's just no good way to print these that would be 100% strong, that wouldn't create some kind of weak point. So, to fix that, I'm going to be using Bondo. Bondo is it's a body filler usually used in automotive repairs, and it's a little toxic and a little difficult to work with for my usual taste. But I do work with it when I need to, but really only when I need. So that's why I've been kind of putting off doing this segment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these a good coat of Bondo, and that will A, make them stronger, and B, clean up these printing artifacts that were left over from support, and it'll help smooth out some of those layer lines I was talking about. Before we actually get into the Bondo, the first step is to sand. Now I'm going to be using a 100 grit sandpaper. This is the roughest one I have on hand at the moment. This is just to rough up the surface, get it ready to adhere better to the Bondo, give it some more grit for the Bondo to grab onto. Okay. There's that smell. Before I get too deep into this, it's time to glove up. Mix to a nice even consistency. And you'll want to do this in relatively small batches. Now you take your hardener, and what you want to do is just drip along a stripe the width of your little pile of goop, and then get mixing before it starts to set. So start on the bottom side. Just spread it on. Nice thin coat, almost like frosting a cake. Don't eat it because you'll die. Guess I could go ahead and do the whole flange. This stuff's not as runny as I remember it being last time I used it. Maybe I didn't mix it as well. Don't forget the edge. Starting to reach that almost crumbly point, which is the sign that it's time to stop. I'm just going to set it in this vise till it sets up. In the meantime, I'm going to start the second part, because there's two of these exhaust pipes. There we go. So to repeat the first process, it's to stripe the width of the amount of material that you're using, and then stir vigorously. And then here, this one has the considerably worse underside of the two. More printer goof ups. Because I have more red hardener per gray goop in this batch, it seems to be setting up much faster than the last one. So that's why it's good to have proper ratios when working with Bondo. So I gotta hurry up and finish this one. Okay, so I'm gonna let these set up for a couple minutes, maybe an hour, maybe two, maybe more, probably more. But I'm gonna let these cure up. I'm gonna clean up the work area, and then when I come back, I'm going to start the next step. Alright, so I've let the exhaust pipes sufficiently dry, and now it's time to hit them with some rough sanding, just to knock down all the crazy bumps. This isn't that difficult. Bondo's pretty easy to sand. This is the first round of a lot of sanding. So I've been going at it with some sanding sponges. Started with 60 grit, then I moved up to 100 grit, and now I'm at 150 grit sanding. These are pretty smooth right now. They have a couple gouges that need to be worked out, a couple rough spots around the corners, but these are almost ready for wet sanding. Okay, on to wet sanding. I went from 100 grit to 300 grit, and I'm going to be wet sanding. From everything I know about wet sanding, just helps to basically is for lubricating the piece, just to get a smoother polish. I'm not exactly sure. All I know is, well, you dip the piece in water. Some people like to wet the sandpaper, some people like to wet the piece that they're working on, but right now I'm just going to try wetting the piece. Alright, so that was the 300 grit. It seems to be a pretty good job. I mean, there's still a few problematic areas. This is feeling absurdly smooth right now. I know it's hard to convey through camera because it looks a lot rougher than it is, but you can't feel that this was 3D printed at all. Now, some chips and scratches and dings are inevitable, and I mean, this is Borderlands, so I can kind of work it into the aesthetic. So now I'm going to progressively step up the sanding and the wet sanding. I finished wet sanding. I gave it just a once over coat with a rattle can paint. So now I'm going to highlight certain areas with rub and buff, and some other areas with some silver paint, and then some highlight spots I'm going to hit with this enamel paint. Let's see if this stuff's still any good. I got this like over 3 years ago. I mean, it looks alright. I think we're good. Okay. So this enamel paint I'm going to use on some high spots. The next step is to give it a light coat of rub and buff. And this is a large piece, so I'm going to go ahead and be a little bit generous with the rub and buff. That is the two colors working together. The rub and buff combined with the rattle can brightens up, makes the whole piece very lively. Okay, now to address some of the issues in the sanding process. I had some trouble getting the whole thing mirror smooth. If I wanted to spend the next 2, 3, 5 weeks on perfecting this, I could have sanded all these out and made them perfect, but I said, hey, it's Borderlands, you know, stuff's chipped and broken, beaten up, so let's embrace that. Let's make that into the aesthetic. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna fill in some of those holes and gaps with this enamel paint, and it'll create a obviously two-toned effect, which will be basically it'll act as the first step in the weathering process to give it some more intentionality, to make it look more like it was supposed to be broken in that way. And the brush is all cracked. Painting in these stress marks basically turns mistakes into bits of character for the piece. Uses a flaw as an accent point. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry for a couple minutes and I'll be right back. Not in this video, but the next video is going to be about weathering the whole blaster as a whole. But in this video, I'm going to do the weathering process for the exhaust pipes and save the rest for the next video. Standard color choice for weathering is usually blacks and reds, and sometimes a little bit of yellow, sometimes a little bit of brown. I'm gonna start with a red base color. Then I'm going to darken it with a little bit of black. And that's pretty much the color that I want. I'm going to grab some, this is a enamel thinner. From here I'm just going to put it in those little spots. I accidentally used way too much thinner, but that can work in my favor so that it seeps into all the little nooks and crannies. Come out with a bit more of an interesting color. And I'm trying to apply the brush strokes all in the same direction, up and down the flange, up and down the muffler, trying to not get anything left to right. And I'm trying to wipe it off the same direction, not anything left to right. That way the wear patterns move all in the same direction. Now for those little dents and defects, I'm gonna put it in there. I'm gonna put the paint in the hole, let it dry a little bit, and then wipe it up. For this higher section, I'm gonna take, I want the rust to be a little bit more concentrated. I'm gonna take a paper towel and I'm gonna use that as the applicator, and it'll give it a more splotchy pattern, more around the corners where it's more likely to get chipped and rusted. This is starting to look pretty good. I'm going to keep these lines smooth and then these spots dabbled. I really like how this is coming out, but I am pleased with how this one turned out, and I'm going to do the second one off screen. In the next video, I'm going to assemble the whole piece and glue it together and weather it completely. So look forward to that in 2 weeks. Bye.